well, how would they, like if you say they have their tree of it's this, 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 and then
Right.
it's the self, like how would they explain?
Right. So I must be the case.
Is like one of the branches.
Behavior X is obviously a function of context X plus something else plus something else.
Is that one of the factors? Like
Right, these are the variables or the factors that go into the behavior. So I would expect that a social psychologists often use exchange dynamics to explain what goes on. Go ahead.
Okay, relating to that, I want to say that you join different groups or different subcultures depending on your personal values. So there will never be a contradiction, but there's a set of behaviors, let's say, that you can within a certain range, depending on what your personal beliefs allow you. And then you engage in different groups according to that. So there will never be a contradiction between your own beliefs and the beliefs of the groups.
Right. So what you're talking about is a consistency theory that has to do with, that is a function of your values, your beliefs, and that within a certain range, as you can maintain consistency with a variety of behaviors.
I mean, like, and maybe they see it sometimes with theater, like, you'll have a person who's really shy and, like, doesn't really talk, and they get up on stage, and there's 100 people there, and they can sing. And, like, I mentioned this in one of my other classes, my sister's this really, like, flighty, all over the place person, and she goes to, CAP, and she is very businesslike. It's the same group of people, the exact same people,
right.
but her personality is completely different. So I just didn't know if, like, it's, like...
See, a cybernetic
like,
approach...
Because it's, it's the same group of people. It's not even different people there, like, where you could say, okay, when you go with different people, you act differently. But, like, if you went with your group of friends to church and to a basketball game, you would act different.
Right.
And I just didn't know if, like, the setting was one of the factors.
Well, see, from a cybernetic perspective, they would look at the systems and the super systems, then the patterns of interrelationships that exist and the patterns of interaction. A social psychologist would begin to ask questions about the traits, the variables, the belongingness, the exchange, the consistency, the desire for inclusion, perhaps, that's often a variable, the desire to belong. And some people have a high need to belong, other people have a low need to belong. I mean, you get this in psychological profiles you take, right? Myers-Briggs, for instance, right? Myers-Briggs has, I haven't done this in so long, but the end one of it is the need for order or tolerance of ambiguity. How much ambiguity can you tolerate? Some people can get in the car and say, let's just go. Yeah. Where are we going to stay? I don't know. Let's find someplace. Other people are like, give me the map, give me a Google map, let me calculate how many restaurants are there on the way, how much is it going to cost, what's the price of gas at each gas station. They have, they're how's that end? Is a P or a J? Yeah, right? J is the count the number of restaurants between the here and where we're going to stop, and we call ahead to make sure they have room and we've made a reservation. Whereas the P person is like, let's go discover it, let's figure it out as we go along. So they look at qualities or traits and characteristics, and they want to relate those to communication behaviors. So a social psychology person might say, well, let's look at, these are root traits. That's what Myers-Briggs says. These are root qualities that can describe a whole lot of other behaviors, explain a lot of other behaviors. Yeah, so this diagram, and again, social psychologists are fond of link causal diagrams, and subscripted variables. BX, meaning a general behavior, is a function of some general context, you know, and B1 and B2 just mean different behaviors.
There's an article about Mitt Romney that I read recently that, I mean, the writer obviously had a particular perspective, so I tried to bear that in mind. But he comes off almost like a smiling sociopath, you know, who sort of adapts to whatever audience is in front of him. As the successful governor of Massachusetts, he ran a very, you know, tolerant, open to gay rights choice.
Right.
He was right up front about that. He wasn't in a gray area. Those were things that he ran on. And now it's, he never said it. And on top of that, he just successfully courted the very religious right of the Republican Party, and got, you know, the blessing of James Dobson and all those guys. And so he seems to be able to be all things to all people, depending on what the payoff is, you know, in terms of a career, in terms of his ambition. So that's part of the formula.
Right. So a critical theorist would look at that and have an explanation of it. A socio-psychological person would ask, what are the individual traits? You know, what variables can I identify and measure that are significant to this question of how his communicative variability, we'll call that CV, that he has, or policy variability, we'll call it PV, you know. And policy variability is a result of, you know, voter pressure plus, you know, whatever it is. They would identify then, okay, then they would say, well, okay, how do we measure voter pressure? You know, how do we do it? Well, we will count the number of articles that appear that say this, and so that'll be this plus this plus this plus this, and we'll calculate the voter pressure, and we'll calculate this, and then we'll do this for each candidate, and we'll come up with an answer. So this is what the socio-psychologist wants to do, and sincerely believes that they are getting at real things, that they're not just creating things. This is the criticism of social psychology, that it creates its own constructs and then finds what it itself has created. So the question is whether we're looking at, you know, an analysis of a structure, or whether we're looking at reality in some way, or we're answering our own questions. This is what Gadamer said in Truth and Method. You know, that your method determines what you get. So, all right. So this is Introduction to Social Psychology. Let me grab one of these diagrams for us. This one is the anchor model. Whose was this? Help me remember now. The idea that how do we calculate your attitudes towards a message, or whether you'll change your message or not? Which was this? I had to go back and find it. Anyway, within social psychology, the question gets asked about people's willingness to hear a message and to change their attitudes about things. You know, how does that happen? So attitudes, beliefs are viewed as a psychological construct that people hold. And so in this particular theory, this is the anchor theory, that if it's close to your anchor point, you'll take the message, you'll amplify its good parts and reject its bad parts. I'm embarrassed that I don't have the title of it. But anyway. So the argument here is you have some base, so this is a theory that attempts to ask the question about attitude change and how will you receive a message. And so it posits variables. That there's a message that comes to you, and when it strikes you, one of the questions that becomes important for you is, how much am I involved in the issue? How relevant is it to me? So, for instance, questions about fire management, of underbrush in the environment. Let's take that as a message. Right now in Montclair, that's not a huge ego involvement issue. We're not all sitting around talking about it. But if you're living in San Diego right now, that's a big issue. How are we going to control the undergrowth so that we don't have these raging brush fires again? So one of the questions that emerges is, does this affect me personally? And so we think of that intuitively, right? You think, well, a message, you're going to pay more, it's going to affect you more if you're personally involved.
To extend a bit on that, we don't even notice most of the times the messages that, because we're so surrounded with messages and they're
right.
an overload, you don't even notice them.
Right.
You don't even get a chance to ask yourself if that's pertinent for you or not. It just goes.
They just come. And that's part of the next model we're going to do is the elaboration likelihood model, which again is a question of how do people pay attention to all the messages that come to them. So that's a psychological theory. But again, this is trying to create a construct that explains the variables involved in how you receive a message that's trying to change your attitude about something. So in this model, they said, okay, one of the major variables we say is the question of ego involvement. Now that's giving a name to a thing that we intuitively, Bob Craig would say, we intuitively know. That the more it affects you, the more, well, that's called ego involvement, I involvement. And so that will then shape the strength with which you deal with it. And so the suggestion here is that of all the statements, let's call it underbrush control. Let's make some statements about underbrush control. That nature should be allowed to run its course. That's a statement, right? You might hear. What's another statement you might hear about, building houses in the woods and okay, well, what would the statement be that would be about that topic? Another statement is, if people are stupid enough to build their homes in the woods, they should expect that.
And not only that, but if it does catch on fire, it wastes, like resources, like lives and resources.
Okay, right. Fighting natural processes risks life and money. Now, again, a rhetorician would look at this differently, right? What would a rhetorician be asking?
Who he's speaking to, first of all.
Okay, what is the audience? What are their beliefs?
Yeah, if it's a bunch of homeowners who want to get back in to that place, he would say, well, we're blessed with opposable thumbs and brains that can, make decisions and dominion over the beasts and so we can get in there and we need to find a way to make it work.
Shape nature. We can reshape nature. Right. So there's a statement. We can reshape the environment. But as a rhetorician, you would be asking, what are the available means of persuasion here? What are the arguments I can marshal? What are the ethical, the ethos, the pathos, the logos arguments? What can I invent, and how would I arrange it? And that's not what a social psychologist is asking. Social psychologist is asking, all right, when you hear all of these, what do you do with them? How do you arrange them in your mind? What works for you and what doesn't work for you?
Do you kind of, would a social psychologist maybe stack them? So that the person would stack them up, say which is the most important?
Yes, yeah. So a social psychologist would ask you which are the most important to you, and would then create a profile of your value system. That can be done in different ways. You'll see in Simlog where it's created in a visual space, a three-dimensional semantic space representing your values and perceptions. So here we can reshape the environment. It's it's our land. We can do what we want with it. We bought it. All right, so you get so in this particular theory, if you're studying a person and the attitude change that's going to go on for them, you would ask yourself, get a whole bunch of statements together that are some that are pro, some that are con, and some that are neutral. And then you ask a person to tell me which of these could you agree with, which would you disagree with, and which are neutral for you. So I ask you that. Now, one person's going to go through here and say, yeah, nature should be allowed to run. If people are stupid enough to do it, they should expect their house to burn down. Fighting nature is risky. We can reshape the environment. No, that's wrong. We shouldn't reshape the environment. That's like Jurassic Park. We fool around with nature and we get bit. Bad idea. Our land, we bought it. No. That's just wrong. Land is more important than people, and our land is next to your land, so that doesn't. So we would end up with a series of statements that would be the points of the issue that we agree with. So you would write them down, and then you'd have the points that you reject, and then you'd have the points that you have. I could go either way about that. The wild owls, are part of this. Well, okay, I don't care. Either way, they can go fly somewhere else. They can get up and fly. So then this theory predicts that everyone will have a different profile, psychological profile of acceptance, rejection, and non-committal. And so then when they receive a message, if the message is within their latitude of acceptance, they will take it as more persuasive than it really is. They will amplify it. They will think, but if there's a message that's against them, they will minimize it. They will push it away, which we know, right? We know that. But this is a way to codify the variables involved. And so we talk about a latitude of acceptance, latitude of rejection. So if you're a persuader, you realize that your best bet at changing the attitude of a person here is not to go after them in their latitude of rejection. To go, you homeowners, and get after them and say all the things they don't believe, because they will just reject it. But if you catch them at the edge of their acceptance, where it's maybe the weakest points of their acceptance, and you push that, you can maybe get some change in their attitude. But if you go right into the biggest things that they already reject, you're going to be, the contrast effect will minimize that message that you're sending them. So this is a socio-psychological theory of attitude change that explains how people form attitudes, that they cluster statements in their minds, And it says, and it describes it, that they have latitudes of acceptance, latitudes of rejection, latitudes of what is it called? Non-commitment, they don't care. And it predicts that if you send them a message that falls into their latitude of rejection, they won't even process. They'll just minimize it. But if you send a message that's within their zone of acceptance, their latitude, their range, and you can figure the range by the strength of their views on these different statements, then you're more likely to have success. So if you're a PR person, you would want to make a whole list of statements about your company or whatever, and then you want to send it out there. You want to get the results back. You want to then calculate the average person or groups of people that you're dealing with, and then design your message to hit on the edge here, rather than designing your message over here. And the benefit of socio-psychological stuff, for at least making presentations and stuff, is that it looks really cool. It looks really good. Like, well, we have a theory that says this and it divides it into this, and here's our instrument for gathering data, and we sent it out, and we gathered this data through a random process, and we have enough to make inferential findings about this. And people are like, oh, that sounds really good. Instead of saying, well, we went out, walked around town, we talked to people about how they felt, and this is what we think we ought to do. Right? I mean, if you're playing with somebody's $300,000 media budget, this looks a whole lot better than we walked around town and talked to people. So this is just an example of a construct, a socio-psychological construct, and how it might be used in a communication. So, any criticisms of this?
How about if messages fall within the non-commitment range?
Right. Yeah, so aspects of the issue you have no feelings about. Yeah. I don't know what the theory says about that. I mean, the main point of this theory says aim at the edges of the latitude of acceptance. That's the main thrust of this theory. Yeah, but it might be, if I were engaged in a long-term attitude change process, I might want to go at some of these to try to see if that would give me some motion in a person.
When there's a change in the weather politically, and you have like the South going from just always voting Democrat to always going over to solid Republican, pretty much.
Right.
Wasn't that because somebody said, we've got this, I think we can exploit this latitude of non-commitment. They're no longer committed to democratic union ideals.
Right, and this approach would give you a very nice tool to say, we did this study 10 years ago, and this was the average latitude of acceptance. And what we've noticed over the 10 years is that a number of items that were in here have moved into here. Right, so that's very scientific, it's very clear. It's not like in a qualitative research. You say, well, I interviewed 100 people, and I read all the interviews, and these are the themes I saw. That's different from doing this kind of a thing where you present the things, you calculate them out, you put them in the categories, and you present them. One's qualitative, one's quantitative.
I was going to say, my family were very Republican, and this is before, Fahrenheit 9/11 and everything. We watched Bowling for Columbine in school, and I went home and we only watched the first 20 minutes. I'm like, Dad, this is a great movie. We have to watch it. And so we go to the store and we rent it, and the first 20 minutes is very common sense. Everyone will agree with it, unless you're a cold-hearted person. You're not going to disagree with the points that he's making and stuff, and then it starts going in like politically to be like, you're kind of on the fence kind of thing, like kind of neutral about it, and then towards the end is like more, you know, his political views one way, and you know, I guess it just kind of like makes sense when you think about it, like because even though my dad turned it off, you know, towards the end, he still got the whole beginning, and because I watched the beginning, I still went and rented it. So like,
start over here.
So even if you turn off the ends, at least some of your message was still heard. Like.
Right. Yeah. So if you're doing strategic planning for public relations or a message delivery, this kind of thing is useful for you. And it's a theory about how to figure out where to go in order to create attitude change and not be rejected offhand. Right? But this is not the only theory of that. All right, any other thoughts or questions? But again, the question of ego involvement comes into play, because if you don't really carry the way, you know, you have this huge area of non-commitment. So as your ego involvement goes up, your non-commitment shrinks, and your rejection goes up. Your areas of rejection go up. So there's a relationship, you know, between things.
Is there a big percentage of people who would look at this and, because I think this makes, so I see what you're saying, how it makes sense. People would look at it and say, yeah, this is great.
Right.
Are there some people who would look at this and just, you know, in a business and be like, this is too much? You know.
Yeah. Well, I'm working with the comps right now, and Kate. I don't know how many of you know Kate. Kate's been in class with Melissa, as one of our long-term students here, and Kate works for the state, or she did work for the state. She does work for the state still, and we're doing her comps around how do you get PR people to use theory and research methods in their everyday life, because a lot of PR people work on the basis of intuition and experience. You know, they say, well, we know this works because we've seen it work before, and we feel like it's going to work, so we'll do it. And then the challenge that Kate's comp question that I'm doing with her is, well, how could you do something with theory that they wouldn't go like, oh, this is too much, you know, we're just done with this. So come to the comps and just no. But Kate's answer is basically you're going to have to really cut it to a very practical point and show, like a book, you know, that says, okay, first do this, you know, now do this, fill in this blank, now do this, all right, and now do you have your answer, and to show that this could be useful in these cases. Yeah, so it's a persuasion question about getting PR practitioners to use methodologies and theories. But yeah, you're right. Some people would be like, that's very nice if you live in the academic world, you can play around with that. We're out here, we got to crank this thing out today and have time to do this. Yeah.
Also, it seems as though mining the center, the latitude of non-commitment, where you're looking at the gray area, you know, you're studying the gray area, it doesn't generate great ratings, you know. I mean, somebody blustering on the left or on the right, telling people what they want to hear day after day and keeping them coming back, reassuring them that what they think is right.
So you're speaking right at the center of somebody's latitude of acceptance.
It's profitable to do that.
Right.
I mean, just look at your radio.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, I listen to NPR, which is public money, and you have to send in money and stuff. And I think a lot of the reason you end up sending in money is because it's really in that, you know, it definitely leans to the left.
It may push you.
But they will have, Newt Gingrich was on last week, you know, and they will have generals on, and they'll be in that gray area where it is uncomfortable and it's not hugely profitable. People don't like to feel lost about where they stand on things.
But, you know, a social psychologist, again, would likely ask the question of, well, what are the psychological variables that are different between a listener to Rush Limbaugh and a listener to NPR? And so can we identify the core traits that are different in that regard? And I think I mentioned this early on in the course. There was some new research about conservative versus liberal political views of people. The brain, yeah, and it was related to the question of, they're actually doing some brain research now that says the way things are connected, some people have less tolerance for diversity and challenge. So a sociopsychologist